Carl ran to his room and crashed onto his bed. He punched the bed frame until his hands were red and swollen. Then he banged his head against the frame until he got too tired to continue. He fell back onto his bed, sobbing. Eventually, he drifted off to sleep in a puddle of tears. Carl found himself in a hammock with pink covers and a fluffy pillow. He sat up and looked around. Golden Christmas lights hung above the bed, and the walls had a painted flower pattern on them. Pink curtains covered the windows, leaving the room sunny yet dull. Carl found some sort of comfort in the room, despite the girly nature. A pretty teenage girl walked in. She wore what appeared to be a maid dress with a swirl pattern on her sleeves. She also had swirls on her hair and swirls on her cheeks. Her dress was as pink and as girly as the room, with her tiny wings being as golden as the lights above. "Carl, what brings you here?" she asked. "How do you know my name?" "That's your name? I simply wanted to call you that." She picked up Carl and set him down, standing. This made Carl notice how tall the girl was. "You're small," she said. "How do you deal with such big people?" I can't do anything but let them have their way." "I pity you. You should stay here. She can't touch you here." So, the maid held Carl's hand and took him through the long hall outside the pretty room. "They haven't come back. They left ages ago. Do you think they'll come back?" the maid asked. "Who are they?" Carl asked. To that, the maid simply stared him down. Carl sighed. "I don't think they're coming back." They reached the stairs, which were covered in pink fluff. The maid flew down the stairs and Carl walked behind. The maid led Carl to a dining room with a long 20-seat table. Each seat had a pen and a sheet of paper. Carl sat on one end, the maid sat on the other. The maid began drawing almost instantly. Carl followed her lead. After a couple of minutes, the maid held up her drawing to show Carl. It was a self-portrait, but without the wings. "This was before I let go of my human skin. Once I let go, I ended up here," the maid explained. "How did you end up here?" "My mother made my skin feel strange. Maybe this is a way to let go." Carl held up a drawing, also a self-portrait. "You're an artist, aren't you?" the maid asked. "Yes, it helps me escape." "What are you escaping?" Carl didn't respond. He just stared blankly. "I don't think you can escape." The maid flipped to the back of her paper. Carl did the same. But before he could finish his drawing, he woke up in his own bed. His mother walked in. She kissed him and called him a pretty boy. She held his hand and dragged him to her room. He shivered, preparing for the disgusting sensation of her hand against his skin. Once her hands were away and she left him alone, Carl sat on the ground with his face in his knees, his eyes hot with tears. He scratched himself, feeling dirty and disgusted in his own skin. Carl dragged himself to his room and pulled a sheet of paper from out of his desk. He sat down and drew the maid he had seen in his dreams. He awaited sleep, ready to see her again. Eventually, he fell asleep at his desk and got exactly what he wanted. He found himself back at the long table with an unfinished drawing. The maid looked at him with a smile. "You're back," she said. "Yes. You said I'm safe here," Carl asked. "You're safe from her, yes," the maid said. "Would you like to go outside?" Carl nodded. They both stood up. The maid flew towards the door and Carl followed behind. Outside, the sky was a pink and peach gradient with fluffy clouds. The grass was long and flowers grew around the place. The wind blew gently and leaves flew in the air. The maid laid down in the grass. Carl sat down beside her. "What if you just Stayed here? The maid asked. I can't. Why? Because this isn't real. Carl felt strange acknowledging this. He felt light rain droplets falling on his shoulders. Of course I'm real. Do you think I'm not? The rain poured down harder. You don't have physical skin. Nothing here is physical. You're not real. Carl now felt unsure of the statement himself. Just because I don't have skin means I'm not real? I'm sitting right in front of you. Of course I'm real. The rain now soaked her. Carl fidgeted with the grass. Maybe my definition of real is wrong. The maid nodded. Yes, you are wrong. I am real. I'm realer than her. You should stay with me. There was a sort of comfort in that statement. Carl smiled. You are realer than her, he said. He repeated it, mumbling to himself. The maid suddenly swept him into a hug. He hugged her back, squeezing his eyes shut and allowing himself to feel nothing but her touch. I'm sorry. You are real, he said. Thank you, the maid said. When Carl opened his eyes, he found himself back at the desk. He took out more paper and drew the maid again. He drew her over and over again. The maid is realer than her, Carl mumbled. His father walked in, seeming tired. He rubbed his eyes. Hey, son, did you do your schoolwork? His father asked. No, Carl said bluntly. Well, do it tomorrow, okay? Carl nodded. Carl found himself sitting at his desk, waiting to fall asleep so he could see the maid again. He couldn't sleep, though. The nap he had taken had apparently left him wide awake. He went to the bathroom to grab some melatonin out of the cabinet. Suddenly he remembered when he had been in this exact bathroom and his mother had bade him touch her. He suddenly felt too dirty to pick up the medicine. He washed his hands and still didn't feel clean. He scratched his hand till it bled, but he still didn't feel clean. He pinned the blame on himself. Why did I do something so dirty? He cried as he poured soap and water onto his hands. The soap burned the scratches on his hands. He stepped away from the sink and leaned against the wall. He closed his eyes. None of this is real. This isn't real. She isn't real. He collapsed onto the ground and tried to sleep. He spent hours lying down and crying until he eventually found himself in the rain next to the maid. Her hair had been taken out of buns, her curls now resting on her shoulders. She stared up at the sky until she noticed Carl. Carl, your face is red, the maid said. I felt so dirty, Carl cried. Dirty? I don't get dirty. I let go of my skin, the maid said. I don't want to feel dirty anymore. Then let go. Carl buried his face in his knees and cried at the maid's side. Once he awoke, he went down to the kitchen. Then let go. The words echoed in his head. He picked up a potato peeler, his hands shaking. He was ready to shave off his skin and let go. He ran the peeler down his arms, wincing as he did it. It was painful, but it was worth it. He would shave off his skin and finally escape. Or at least, that's what he believed.